Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I've been a huge fan of Engineers Without Borders for as long as I've known Danny, actually. I think I was here last year as part of a panel, and to see the group continue to grow and achieve amazing things is very inspiring. So it was a privilege to be asked to speak. Some of you will know perhaps quite a lot about Better Place, some of you will know very little. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about what we do, but I wanted to do so in a way that I suppose celebrated the criticality of the engineering profession to making meaningful action on climate change. Because no matter how passionate people are, and no matter how much they want things to change, until we actually find solutions that actually work, we won't get that change. And if ever there was any evidence of the problems of passion and politics not being enough, I think you've seen it this week. And it will continue for some time, a debate that's all about nonsense and nothing about facts and nothing about what works. And even within the sustainability community, where everybody is agreed and everyone is passionate about the need for change, we need to have some harder debates about what's actually going to work and what isn't. Because all solutions are not created equal. And as engineers, you intuitively understand that. And you understand that it actually takes some real thinking, some real analytics, and often a great degree of creativity to find out what works, what isn't working, why it doesn't work, and how you might make it work. And so I think that's part of what we've tried to do at Better Place and will continue to do, and indeed that's why we have so many engineers in our own organisations, and my hope is that that may indeed include some of you in the future. So Better Place is, as you would have gathered from Kai's scoop, we are a business. We have to raise a lot of money in order to build the infrastructure necessary to make electric vehicles a mass market reality. And to do that, we obviously have to deliver a return to the people that give us that money. So that requires us to be a business, but we are more than a business. And I guess this is part of a theme that I think, Danny and I have had this discussion several times. I think in the world that you're going into, the distinctions between the three sectors, between business, government and the community sector, I hope are beginning to blur, because increasingly I think it's important for people in each of those sectors to understand how the other sector works, and indeed for organisations like the one I have the privilege of leading to not see ourselves as solely confined to one. There's no one who works at Better Place who is absolutely passionately committed to our mission, and our mission is to end the world's addiction to oil. And the issues that we're trying to have an impact on and the scale that we hope to have an impact on range across a wide range of fundamental public policy issues that certainly for me as someone who's spent time in government, you would hope to impact through government, and yet at the end of the day we are also a business. So I'd encourage you to think broadly about the work you do wherever you do it, and how it can have public policy impact, how it can have the passion and commitment of a community organisation and the purity of ideals that many community organisations have, and how it has the practical capacity to be self-sustaining financially and to create jobs and do other things that often happen in the business world. So our mission is to end the world's addiction to oil, and when Shai Agassi, our founder, began doing the analysis of how we might help make that happen, he didn't have any fixed ideas about how we would make it happen. Simply started with the proposition that if we don't end the world's addiction to oil, the emissions outcomes will get continually more catastrophic. It's about 25% of the world's emissions currently come from the transport fleet. The economic impact will become increasingly severe as more and more economies and more households become completely hostage to petrol prices and their increasing size and volatility. And the world will continue to become a less peaceful place, unfortunately, because most of the world's oil is held by regimes that don't tend to be very nice people. And so if we could end the world's addiction to oil, we could make a fundamental impact on all three of those things. So that's a worthy goal, and we could all feel very passionate about it. The question is, how do you actually make that work? And that's where a little bit of engineering wisdom, I think, is helpful. We looked at three obvious solutions, the usual suspects: hydrogen, ethanol and electric vehicles. And I guess some basic analysis told us that only one of those three had any realistic prospect of being a mass adopted solution. And I'll share our thinking with you, because as engineers I think you'll appreciate and understand where we're coming from, and you may disagree and we should have that discussion. always open to that debate. The sexiest possible way to run a transport fleet, of course, is with hydrogen. What could be nicer? You burn hydrogen with oxygen, you get water as an outcome, and everybody's happy. Hydrogen is by far the sexiest solution for the transport problem. Particularly sexy, I should say, for the oil industry, who have been the greatest proponents of hydrogen as a solution, particularly through the Bush administration in the US. And the reason the oil industry is so enamoured with hydrogen as a solution is because it's incredibly sexy and it's never going to happen. And so that is, as you could understand, the perfect solution for the oil industry. The reason it's never going to happen is not because you can't run a car on a hydrogen fuel cell. Of course you can. They currently cost about $500,000 each, but I will be the first to concede that you could see those prices dramatically plummet if you got volume and you solved a couple of key technical problems. But being able to make one car that runs on hydrogen is not a solution to the mass adoption of a new form of transport. You have to make all the cars run on hydrogen. And to do that, you have two fundamental problems. The first problem is that the energy it takes to make the hydrogen is much greater than the energy you get out of the hydrogen in the vehicle. So that's kind of a fundamental problem in physics. But the even more practical financial reality problem is if people are going to fill the car up with hydrogen wherever they drive, then you need to build hydrogen distribution infrastructure, of which we currently have none. And the cost of that is just astronomical. And so as a practical matter, that is not going to happen. It is not going to happen anytime soon. That has been our view for 4 years now. When the Obama administration was elected, they appointed the most qualified Secretary of Energy ever for the history of the position, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, Stephen Chu, and by far the most committed to alternative energy secretary there's ever been in the US. They used to often be, in fact, appointees of the oil industry. A guy who devoted his professional life to alternative energy. And within less than 3 months of taking that position in the Obama administration, despite all of the support, both legislative and financial, that he oversaw to a wide range of renewable energy projects, he made one startling decision. He took the entire hydrogen fuel cell vehicle research program and shot it. Closed the whole thing down. Because, in his view, it was bogus. And it was never going to happen, at least not in the foreseeable future. So for those of you who may be hydrogen fans, for good reasons, that was our analysis. Again, we didn't come into this with any lack of enthusiasm for hydrogen, and there may well be other applications for hydrogen fuel cells and similar technologies which are very exciting, and we're not here to poo-poo any of that. We're simply here to say, cannot see how that's going to happen for 12 million vehicles in this country anytime soon. And we need some action sometime real soon. The second solution is biofuels and ethanol. Now, there's a couple of practical problems there. The first current problem is that most of the world's ethanol these days comes from food sources, and so there's a basic food shortage crisis that you would only exacerbate if you moved large volumes, again mass adoption, large volumes of the transport fleet onto ethanol. But let's assume that second generation and cellulosic ethanols came through so that non-food sources could provide it. You still have a fundamental problem with ethanol, which is the internal combustion engine. Now again, as engineers, many of you would understand intuitively, the internal combustion engine is an incredibly complex device that has taken 100 years of engineering perfection to get a half-decent solution to the wrong problem. If you want a powertrain for a vehicle, an electric motor has one moving part. It gives you 100% of the torque of the motor the moment you hit the pedal. It has been and will always be and has always been the best powertrain for locomotive force in a vehicle. There were more electric vehicles than there were internal combustion engine vehicles 110 years ago. It was obvious then, as it is obvious now to the engineers, that that was a much better powertrain for the vehicle. The problem was not the electric motor as a powertrain. The problem is that you couldn't keep energy in the vehicle. And as people started touring around in their sort of pre-Model T cruising cars going into the countryside, there was no electricity grid. The batteries of the time were primitive and rudimentary. And so there was no way of keeping energy in the vehicle to drive wherever you wanted to go. And no matter how clumsy liquid fuels transported by horse and buggy and barrel load might have been in the early days, the reason they call them barrels of oil, that at least solved the problem. Now, fast forward the clock 110 years, we do have an electricity grid. The latest generation of batteries, particularly a modern lithium iron phosphate battery, really does do the job. And so it's possible to keep energy in the vehicle, though there's some real challenges, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so then you come back to the question, why would you have an internal combustion engine with 400 or 500 moving parts with an energy efficiency on average in city cycle of about 15% compared to an electric motor with an energy efficiency of about 85%? Makes no sense. The reason I've gone through that entire discourse when I talk about ethanol is the good folk at Stanford University recently published a paper which made the simple and obvious fact and conclusion that even if you love biofuels, and I think they're great, and the obvious net life cycle zero emissions is attractive, if you wanted to use them in transportation, you wouldn't burn them in an internal combustion engine. You'd use them in in some highly efficient power generation environment and then use the electricity to run through an electric motor. So if you want to generate your zero emissions electricity through biofuels versus solar or wind or geothermal, go nuts. And that may well be a good idea. I have no problem with it. But either way, you'd want to be driving an electric vehicle to have the most both economically and environmentally effective solution that uses biofuels. So that then left us with, again, the electric car as the alternative. And again, there are three barriers to the mass adoption of electric vehicles. The first and most important is that you want to drive it wherever you want, whenever you want. That's what you can do with a petrol car, and you need to be able to do it with an electric car. And whilst a modern lithium iron phosphate battery gives you a decent amount of range, typically sort of 160 to 200 kilometres, and for most people on most days, because you'll recharge it, possibly during the day, but certainly overnight, that will do you. There's always going to be a time when you want to drive a longer distance than that in a single day, and then it would take hours and hours to recharge the battery. So that's the first barrier. How do you overcome that problem? It's the most fundamental problem. The second problem is cost, but not cost in the way we might normally think about it. The overall cost of running an electric vehicle is actually, for many drivers, already cheaper than a petrol car, and given current trends, within 5 years for the vast majority of drivers will be cheaper. The problem is the shape of the cost. Batteries are very expensive, but electricity is very, very cheap. So over the life cycle, it's cheaper to run than a petrol car, particularly a gas-guzzling petrol car or a car that drives long distances. But you've got to stump up the cost of the battery up front, which for many people would be a major barrier to the mass adoption of those vehicles. An extra $15,000 for the battery sounds like a lot. Even if you don't realise you might be spending $4,000 or $5,000 a year on petrol, as many people in fact do, particularly in the outer suburbs of places like Australia's major cities. So you need to solve the cost problem, the shape of the cost. And the third problem, of course, is that you want to make sure it's zero emissions. And as we well know, particularly in this country, particularly unfortunately in the state of Victoria, where the bulk of our electricity is generated by brown coal, you can't simply assume that by using an electric vehicle you've got a zero emissions vehicle. I might say, and I want to be really clear about this, and there's been a lot of debate about this, but I can refer you to a run into your papers. Even if you ran an electric vehicle off Victorian brown coal-fired electricity, you would still have a net reduction in emissions of about 15%. But I don't think you or I or any of us should be interested in 15% reductions in emissions. I think we should be interested in 100% reductions in emissions. And there are a range of ways that you can ensure that electric vehicles are powered solely by renewable energy and therefore deliver a zero emissions outcome. In fact, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, not only is that possible, but the electric vehicle, because of the storage capacity of its battery, becomes the best thing that has ever happened to renewable generation, particularly intermittent renewable generation like wind and solar. I'll come back to that in a sec. So those are the three problems we had to solve. Again, a little bit of engineering prowess is required, financial engineering for the middle problem, the cost problem, and genuine engineering for the other two. The range problem we think we have pretty much solved. It requires a two-tiered infrastructure. The most important and the least sexy is simply when you park the car, you plug it in. And for most people, most of the time, that's all they'll need to do. You'll wake up every morning with a full battery, a full tank if you like, and you'll drive off in most cases to work, and whether that's 10 Ks or 60, your battery will still be 3/4 full most likely, or close to it. And then you'll park the car and plug it in and go off to work, and you'll come back and your battery will most likely then be full again or close to it. And that's how you cycle around, much as we do with our mobile phones or other devices with rechargeable batteries. So the simple expedient of putting plug-in points in the main places where you park your car for an extended period, which is mainly at home and at work, and to a lesser extent in shopping centres, sporting venues, train stations, airports, etc. That'll solve most of the problem of keeping energy in the vehicle. But sooner or later you're going to want to keep driving. You're going to be on a long drive down the coast or up the country, or you're a commercial vehicle with a long delivery route or something. You're going to get that battery down close to zero, and you don't want to stop and park and plug it in and wait for it to charge up. You want to keep driving. You want to keep driving with the same convenience you have with a petrol car, which is a 5 to 7 minute stop to stop, fill up the tank, go in and pay, come back out and get on the road. And so for that purpose, we looked at a number of different solutions. And again, a bit of kind of engineering and business common sense led us to a profound belief that of the 3 available solutions, one was far more likely than the other 2 to be viable for mass adoption. And so the 3 possible solutions were hybrids, so a not pure electric car, but what we see now already, which is a hybrid solution, either series or parallel hybrid. 2 powertrains, very expensive to build, very expensive to service, as a consequence poor resale value, and as a consequence fundamentally uneconomic for the average driver. And I think it's important to understand this. Many of you are probably excited and enamoured with hybrid vehicles, at least as the best solution we have now, and that's a great thing, and I applaud people who buy them. But I want to be really clear. Of the 8 million cars that were sold in this country in the last decade, 16,000 of them were hybrids. This is not a mass market solution. It is not an affordable solution for the average family. It is not an affordable solution for the average family in the outer suburbs of our major cities, and they are the people who use all the petrol and generate all the emissions. The good folk of Northcote and Balmain who go out and buy a Prius are doing a great thing, but the truth is they weren't generating that many emissions before, and they've taken a little bit away from that, and that is to be commended, but it is not changing the answer, not by a long shot. It's the folks in the outer suburbs driving the big cars, 25,000 kilometres a year and more, who are using all the petrol and generating all the emissions. And unless we have a solution that is affordable to them, then we don't have a mass solution for the problem and all of the problems associated with the oil addiction of which they are currently afflicted. The second solution, which most of the car companies like because they're automotive engineers, not electrical engineers, is fast charge. Well, you want to charge the battery up in 5 minutes, no problem. How much voltage do you need? We'll just zap it all in there. Now, I think many of you are giggling because you can do the math. You've got a 25 kilowatt hour battery in the car. You want to fill it in 5 minutes. You guessed it, that's 300 kilowatts a load. For those of you who are not elect engineers, let me help you through this. So on a wet Thursday night, with rain pouring down and 2 kids in the back of the car, you're going to plug 50 households worth of electricity through a cable half as thick as my arm into the back of your car. I suspect not. But even if you could overcome the safety issue with fast charging that fast, and no one has actually solved the technical issues to do it that fast yet. If you do it that fast currently, no one's got the power electronics right or the battery management systems right, so you degrade the battery, which is the single most expensive thing in the car. So that turns out to be a very expensive way to charge a battery, which is to kill it. Even if you fix the technical problems, even if you fix the safety problems, it's fine again, thinking as an automotive engineer, to say, well, I can do this with one car, because you probably could. Maybe even economically affordably for the average punter. But take me through this again. So your average suburban substation is 2 to 4 megawatts. So when 50 of these things pull up at 5:30 on a hot Thursday night in the middle of peak load electricity in Whitehorse Road, Nunawading, and want to fill up at the same time, we're going to take out about 12 suburbs to fill up those 50 cars. And the other 11,999,950 cars will have to wait for another time. So you can see the problem with fast charge, attractive as it may seem to an automotive engineer, with all due respect to any auto eng folk in the room, does not satisfy the constraints of the electricity grid by at least 2 orders of magnitude. That scalability thing, of which many of you are familiar across a range of engineering disciplines, does kind of kick in at this point. So much as we would love to fast charge vehicles, that'd be a great solution, it's not going to work. At least it's not going to work at mass scale. There may be applications for fast charge, but not at mass scale. So the alternative solution that we have worked on, not because again we had any religious attraction to it, just it was the only one we could find that would work at mass scale, is battery swapping. As you get down to your last 40 or 50 kilometres, your GPS system says, you know, if you're going to keep driving for the next half an hour or more, you really need to pull into a battery swap station. Here's where they are. in the direction that you're driving. You pull into one, a robotic system undoes the latches, you have gravity feed of the battery down, you have a new battery inserted with some robotic elements to keep it aligned, you close the latching mechanism, you do a safety check, and 2 minutes later you are back on the road with a fully charged battery. Seems an inelegant solution compared to the other two, but it's actually the only one that we can see that will enable mass adoption at an affordable price. Now, somebody has to build that infrastructure, but it turns out that that is also affordable because the competition is a $24 billion a year gasoline industry, which is waiting to be taken to pieces. So that's what we're going to try and do. So, that's the very short version of my investor pitch. It only has 2 charts. It says, this is a $24 billion per annum gasoline industry that will be a $40 billion gasoline industry, that's just in Australia, per year by 2020. It has no competitors. And the second chart, which says the cost of batteries is going down, the cost of petrol is going up. You are here. Did I miss anything? And surprisingly, that very simple proposition seems fairly attractive to investors who could see how the movie is going to end. So what Better Place is seeking to do is to do whatever is necessary to enable the mass adoption of zero emissions electric vehicles. And so the biggest problem we have to solve is range. You can drive wherever you want, whenever you want. We do that by a combination of simple plug-in points, well, they're not that simple actually, they're fairly intelligent, but they're cheap because there's going to be millions of them, wherever you're likely to park the car. And then battery swapping, mainly on the outer rims of the major cities and the major connecting highways, so that you can drive wherever you want, whenever you want, even if that's a long drive. Now, sensible people in this audience will have a million questions about battery exchange. We'll have time for perhaps a few of them later today. There's a whole lot of very sensible questions you'd want to ask, and to get some comfort that we're not crazy on this, because we're not suggesting there's going to be a single uniform standard of battery, and there's a whole other questions that are probably occurring to you. But we have thought them through, I hope. As you can see, we've tried to think through the rest of this problem. So that's broadly what we are going to do. Given that the batteries are going to be swapped, you're not going to want to own a battery because then you get someone else's, and what if theirs wasn't as good as yours, and how does that work, and who wants to pay for a battery anyway because that's too expensive. So we'll buy the battery. So we'll buy the battery for all the cars. We'll put in plug-in points at your home and your work when you buy a new electric vehicle and sign up as a Better Place subscriber. We will buy all of the electricity for the entire network wherever you plug it in. It will be zero emissions electricity. So you'll get everything you need for a single monthly subscription that will cost you less than petrol. And we think that that's going to be an attractive solution because that, combined with an electric vehicle, which is cheaper to produce than an equivalent petrol car, means you get motoring that is faster, quieter, cheaper and greener, which I think is a reasonably good combination. So that's what we're trying to do. That solves the second problem, which is cost. So once we take the battery cost out of the equation and just get it back from you as you displace petrol from your otherwise very expensive weekly habits, you're okay with that and we're okay with that. The final problem, the final barrier then, is how do we make sure that electric vehicles are zero emissions? In many ways that's the most important, particularly in the current climate. So let me explain to you a little bit about how we do that. Firstly, in a simple sense, as every new electric vehicle comes onto the road, we know with some certainty that it's going to have a lifetime of electricity requirements, and across a portfolio of vehicles we know what that is. As a consequence, as we get a new batch of subscribers, we then sign long-term, I mean 12 to 15-year, off-take agreements with renewable generators to supply all of that volume of power. In fact, we'll be the largest customer of renewable energy in the country. We'll give a volume that they haven't had before, which will help bring them to scale and reduce cost. And by signing 15-year offtake agreements, will enable them to finance that new capacity when that's otherwise often very difficult to finance. But it goes further than that. Not only will we provide them with the scale that they haven't had before and the financial security that will allow them to actually invest, we will also be able to pay a fair commercial price for that electricity, because we're displacing expensive carbon as opposed to cheap carbon. We need to displace all the carbon, but logically, if you can put on the business hat for a moment, the easiest carbon to get rid of would be the most expensive carbon, right? Because it'll be easier to find a cheap solution. So we have a cheap solution. Even renewable electricity is about 3 cents a kilometre and petrol's about 13. So we can afford to pay a full commercial price for renewable electricity without it hurting the underlying economics of our business, even after you cover the amortised capital cost of the battery. And secondly, because for a lot of the renewable generators, particularly wind generators, when more and more wind comes on stream, the wind tends to blow at the same time and a lot of supply hits the market at the same time, and with flexible power prices in a competitive power market, the pool price goes close to zero because there's too much power available and not enough people to use it. Even more extreme in a country like Denmark, where we just closed a huge deal with the largest owner of wind power, where more than half of their wind power was at night when the power wasn't really needed, and they would either shed that power or give it away to the Germans. So we said, well, no, don't do that. Why don't you dump it all into our batteries overnight, and it will all, every single electron, have a high value use tomorrow, displacing gasoline. And so the price umbrella of gasoline in the transport market allows us to pay full commercial price for renewable energy in the stationary energy market. I feel like there's a free box of steak knives at the end of this pitch because it goes on from there. That's how we believe we can deliver sustainable motoring at a lower cost with zero emissions for mass adoption. And it's a hugely, hugely transformative and exciting project. And it's not just us, there are many other companies that see the opportunity for electric vehicles, but we're certainly trying to provide some leadership. But the final thing I want to leave you with is then the impact we have on the electricity system is much greater than that, as the power engineers among you will understand. The problem with electricity is you have to generate it at the same moment you use it. And as demand goes up and down, it creates peaks, and you have to engineer and architect the entire system, generation, transmission and distribution, to cover the 3 hot days in February when you have peak load. And the system is incredibly expensive and inefficiently used the rest of the time. And further to that, the renewable generators have a fundamental problem. The wind and solar folks are intermittent. When the wind stops blowing and the sun stops shining, they can't deliver power. If they can't guarantee delivery, they can't sell into the baseload industrial power applications that form the guts of the consumption base. The holy grail of electricity is storage. If you could store electricity, you could move that load curve around through time, then you fundamentally change the whole dynamics of the electricity system in general, and in particular for the renewable generators who are intermittent, you could help them iron out that intermittency. If you convert 12 million Australian cars from petrol to electricity with 25 kilowatt hours, or probably more by the time this happens, of storage, you've got roughly an entire day's generation load in intelligent storage distributed at the point of use. You've completely changed the architecture of the electricity system. I don't have time now to go through all the ways in which that helps, but I think the smart folk here who understand how powerful a concept that is will understand pretty quickly that you fundamentally changed the dynamics generally of the electricity system, massively improved its economics, and if you use that storage asset strategically in favour of renewable generators, you have the potential to enable the mass deployment of renewable generation into baseload power, which we can't currently do at any price because of its intermittency. And so some of you will be familiar with Peter Newman, probably the top public transport academic in the country. His people at Curtin University have done a bunch of modelling on the potential impact of an electric vehicle fleet, not just on emissions through the transport field in displacing gasoline and diesel, but the impact that the storage of those batteries could have on the mass adoption of intermittent renewable generation in stationary energy. And their belief was that, or their modelling suggests that somewhere between 3 and 10 times greater emissions reduction impact will happen in stationary energy than you would already have in the transport fleet by displacing gasoline from transport, which is about 9% of Australia's emissions in the light vehicle fleet. So that's an incredibly exciting prospect. That's why I guess so many of us have been so drawn to this project. We have, well, 6 months ago we had 18,000 unsolicited resumes from people that wanted to work with us. I suspect it's more than double that now. Nobody gets a chance to work with us who isn't passionately committed to the mission, as you can probably understand, but there's no shortage of them. We have a great privilege of being able to work with some incredible people, both inside and outside the company. And again, I hope that some of you may well join that group in years to come. Regardless of that, what we're also doing in part of this notion of not just being a business, but in a sense part of a broader movement, we're helping build that movement and creating a large community of people who passionately support the notion of zero emissions electric vehicles. So I would encourage all of you, at minimum, if you support what we're trying to do, to go to our website and sign yourselves up and become part of that movement. One of the things I was helped found in a former life that many of you probably also know is GetUp. And we believe that there were a lot of people out there that wanted things to change and they didn't have any central organising mechanism, and I think we've now got 380,000 members who through online organisation can have a collective impact that they could never have had individually. So I'm not sure that Better Place and the environmental and the EV movement will get quite that big, but I think it will be pretty big as people understand the potential transformative power of what electric vehicles can do. So that's who Better Place is. Thank you for your time. I'd love to answer at least a few of your questions, and again invite you to come to our website and become part of our broader community. We'd love to be involved with you. Thanks.